The banquet hall looked flawless. Gold and white balloons drifted beneath the high ceiling, fresh flowers were everywhere, and the table was overflowing with my favorite dishes, from crab cakes to roasted turkey. My son, Christopher, who had recently turned 38, had outdone himself. Looking at him, I thought he was still that same attentive boy I had raised in our cozy home in Connecticut. Or at least, that's what I thought while my heart was still warmed by gratitude. My 65th birthday celebration, surrounded by family and friends, was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. But then Robert, my husband of 42 years, leaned in and whispered in my ear with such urgency that everything inside me went cold. "Get your purse. We're leaving. Right now. Act like nothing is wrong." My name is Abigail Walker, I'm 64 years old. And in that moment, looking at my husband's tense face, I knew something terrible had happened. Robert was never prone to drama. In 4 decades together, he had always been the rational, calm one. The man who solved every problem with logic and patience. Seeing him like this, pale, in a cold sweat, his hands trembling slightly, was more terrifying than any words could be. "Robert, what?" I started, but he squeezed my hand tight. "Smile. Thank Chris for the lovely evening, and let's go. Trust me." His voice was low, but it carried an authority I only recognized from the most critical moments of our lives. I did as he asked. I smiled at Christopher, who was standing at the other end of the hall talking animatedly with his wife, Amber. I waved to them and theatrically pressed my hand to my heart in a gesture of exaggerated gratitude. Grabbing my purse from the chair, I walked over to them with Robert. "Son," I said, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "The party is just wonderful, but I just remembered I have an online consultation with my cardiologist that I can't miss. You know these new insurance rules and the patient portal scheduling. We have to head out." It was a lie. There was no appointment. But my son knew about my heart issues, a couple of episodes of arrhythmia over the last 3 years that we managed with medication, but which always caused him concern. It was the perfect excuse. Something flickered in Christopher's eyes. It was instantaneous, almost imperceptible. Surprise, irritation, fear. I didn't have time to process the emotion before he slipped back on his mask of a sympathetic smile. "Mom, the party just started. Can't it be rescheduled? It's Saturday." "That's the thing, Chris. The on-call doctor is strictly on schedule. You know how our healthcare system works." Amber stepped closer. My daughter-in-law was 35, a blonde, always impeccably dressed, the quintessential suburban wife with a blindingly white vinyl smile. In the 7 years she had been in our family, I had honestly tried to love her. But there was always something about her I couldn't grasp. The falseness in her smile, a coldness in her eyes that never vanished, even when she laughed. "Mother-in-law, what a shame," she cooed. "But health comes first. Maybe we can move the celebration to next weekend in the Hamptons?" "Don't bother," Robert intervened, his voice sharper than usual. "Abigail can come back later on her own if she wants. You all stay, eat, and have fun. She just needs a quick checkup." Another lie. I knew we wouldn't be coming back. We left the hall under the puzzled stares of our guests, friends, cousins, business associates. They had all come to congratulate me, and I was leaving before the birthday cake was even served. In the hallway, I quickened my pace, barely keeping up with Robert. He was practically running toward our Lexus in the parking lot. As soon as we got into the car, he locked all the doors. "Robert, for heaven's sake, tell me what's going on." He pulled out his phone, unlocked it, and opened a messaging app. His hands were still shaking. "Something very bad has happened. Look at this." I took the phone. The first message was to Christopher from an unknown number. "Everything is ready for today. The powder is already in her drink. It's colorless and odorless. The reaction will start 10 minutes after she drinks it. It will look like a typical heart attack. No one will suspect a thing, given her history." My heart, that very heart they planned to stop, began to beat at a frantic pace. I read the next message from my son. "Perfect. As soon as she goes down, I'll call 911. The hospital will record it as death by natural causes. Dad will be a widower and devastated. After that, transferring his trust and 401k to us will just be a matter of time." The next message was from Amber. Chris is nervous. What if something goes wrong? The reply. Nothing will go wrong. You've done this before. It works. In 2 weeks, we'll have access to the money. $15 million is on the line. It's worth it. You've done this before. Those words echoed in my head. My son. My boy, whom I carried under my heart, whom I rocked to sleep at night, whom I had loved unconditionally all these years, was planning my murder for insurance and an inheritance. My purse slipped from my hands onto the car mat. I began to shake so violently I nearly dropped the phone. This can't be true, I whispered. Not Christopher. No, he would never. Robert took my hand, and I saw tears in his eyes. In 42 years of marriage, I had only seen him cry 3 times. When Chris was born at his father's funeral, and now. I wish it were a mistake, Abby. I've spent 2 days praying this was some sick joke. But it isn't. Our son was planning to kill you. I looked out the car window at the club building, where my anniversary was still underway, where my son and daughter-in-law were waiting for me to drink a poison cocktail and die. At 64, I realized I didn't know my own child at all, and that a mother's love, no matter how strong, is no guarantee of reciprocity. Robert started the engine. Where are we going? I asked in a cracked voice. To a safe place. And then we'll decide what to do. Because I guarantee you one thing, he looked at me with a steeled resolve that replaced his tears. They will not get away with this. As we drove away, I looked back at the festive lights one last time. My 65th birthday had nearly become my funeral. 2 days earlier, Robert had woken up at 5 in the morning with a splitting migraine. He told me all of this as we drove aimlessly through the night streets of Greenwich, far from the conspiracy and betrayal. I listened in silence, still trying to grasp that this wasn't a nightmare. I went downstairs for medicine, Robert explained. You know how I always forget where things are. I thought I'd left my iPad in the kitchen. Our house is big, 3 floors in a prestigious neighborhood we bought 15 years ago when our development business finally took off. Robert and I had started from scratch. I worked as a realtor, he was a civil engineer. 40 years later, we had a company with 24 employees and $15 million in assets, real estate, and investment portfolios. The iPad wasn't in the kitchen, he continued. I remembered I'd lent it to Chris last week when he came over for dinner. He said he was having trouble with his MacBook. I sent him a text asking if he had the tablet. He replied that had left it in our guest house, where he and Amber stayed sometimes. I went there at 6 in the morning, thinking they were asleep. Christopher and Amber lived in a Brooklyn townhouse we had given them as a wedding gift. A property worth about $800,000. At the time, it seemed like a generous gift. Now, it looked like a paltry crumb compared to the greed consuming my son from within. The tablet was on the table. I picked it up, and the screen lit up. It was synced to Chris' iPhone via iCloud. Message notifications were popping up one after another. I didn't mean to spy, you know I respect privacy. But one message had a word that made me freeze. Poison. Robert swallowed hard. I thought I was seeing things. I unlocked the screen. The passcode was his birth date, he never changed it. And there were pages of messages. Chris was discussing everything with Amber's cousin, a guy named Brian who works in a chemical lab in New Jersey. They planned every detail. The type of substance, symptoms identical to a heart attack, the exact dosage. Abigail has a heart condition, Chris wrote, so an autopsy will be a formality. No one will dig deeper. Robert paused for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. My son talked about your death like a business deal. A clean solution, no risks, those were his words. I stood there in the guest house, paralyzed. Then I heard Amber coming out of the shower, so I closed everything quickly and left. He returned to the house in a state of shock. I was still asleep then. He didn't say a word to me. He needed time to process the monstrosity of the discovery. He spent the whole day at the computer, hired a private investigator through his connections in the construction business. He asked them to check everything about Amber. Everything. And that's when the second bomb went off. Amber Wilson was not who she claimed to be. Or rather, the name was real, but her past was hidden behind a thick veil. She had been married before. Her first husband, a successful 52-year-old developer from Illinois, had died 9 years ago, supposedly from a fall down the stairs in their home. The police investigated then, but closed the case as an accident. Amber inherited everything. About $2 million in insurance and assets. The deceased family tried to contest the will, claiming it had been rewritten just weeks before his death, but they couldn't prove a thing. With that money, she created a new image for herself. She traveled, bought designer clothes, and moved in expensive circles. That's where she met Christopher 8 years ago at a New Year's Eve party in Miami. He was 30, working for us, making a good living but not living lavishly. And Amber was beautiful, sophisticated, with her own capital. She planned this from the very beginning, Robert said, and the reality hit me like a physical blow. She studied our family, she knew about our accounts. Chris was her target. But what about Chris? My voice broke into a rasp. Is he a victim or an accomplice? Robert looked at me with deep sadness. The messages leave no doubt, Abby. He knew everything. He agreed. He was actively involved in the planning. Our son is not a victim. He is a criminal. We parked on the waterfront. Robert turned off the ignition. We sat in silence to the sound of the Long Island Sound tide. Why? I finally asked. We gave him everything. A top Ivy League education, love, opportunities. He works with us, gets great bonuses. Why? Greed? Robert scoffed bitterly. And impatience. He knows we're healthy and could live another 30 years. But he wants those millions now. Remember our decision 2 years ago? I remembered. When Robert's parents died, they left an inheritance of about $3 million. We decided to donate a third of that to children's charities. It was our joint decision. Chris flew into a rage then. He screamed that we were throwing away family money. We had a massive fight. He didn't speak to us for weeks, but then he came over, apologized, and said he had been selfish. It was a lie, Robert said. He didn't apologize. He just harbored a grudge that Amber fueled all these years. The detective found out something else. Chris has massive debts. He invested in crypto at the peak and lost nearly $500,000. He hid it from us. Amber covered some of it, but they're still in a hole. They're desperate, Abby. Desperate enough to kill. I watched the lights on the far shore. The vast, indifferent world kept moving while my own was collapsing. What are we going to do? I asked. I don't know yet. But I know one thing for sure. They won't succeed. At that moment, sitting in the car, I made a decision. If my son decided to destroy me, I would fight until the end. The first thing I did when we got home was break down in tears. I cried like I hadn't cried in decades. Robert held me, and we mourned the son we thought we knew. We mourned the lost faith in people and a betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. When the tears dried, a cold fury took their place. Tell me everything from the beginning, I asked, sitting on the sofa. We need to understand where we went wrong. Robert brought 2 glasses of water and began to reconstruct the chronicle of our lives, no longer as happy memories, but like a pathologist searching for the cause of a disease. We met in 1982. I was 22, he was 24. I was working as a secretary in a small real estate agency. He had just graduated from engineering school. We married a year later. Chris was born in '84. He was a calm baby, then a sweet boy, then a smart teenager. Or was that just what we wanted to think? Were there signs we ignored? He was always painfully competitive, Robert said thoughtfully. Remember the chess tournament at school when he was 10? He took second place and sobbed with rage, not sadness. He shouted that the winner cheated, that first place belonged to him. I thought it was just childhood ambition. In his teens, it was never enough for Chris. The best sneakers, the latest gadgets, the coolest parties. We worked ourselves to the bone to give him everything, but he was never truly grateful. For his 18th birthday, he demanded an imported sports car that cost 3 times what we could afford. When we offered him a reliable new sedan, he refused. He said he'd rather have nothing than mediocrity. In the 90s, our business surged. I became a top broker. Robert opened a construction firm. We worked together, bought plots, built luxury housing. Gradually, our capital grew. Chris studied business administration and joined the company at 23. For years, everything seemed normal. Until Amber showed up. Remember their first dinner at our place? I asked. I remember. You said you didn't like her. It was true. Something about the way she appraised our decor, the way she casually asked about our investment portfolios and the company's value, rubbed me the wrong way. At the time, I chalked it up to her insecurity and desire to impress us. Now I understood. She was just measuring the size of the prize. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Robert's connections in the construction industry and his years of working with local authorities in Connecticut gave us a head start. We weren't just a couple of retirees, we were the Walkers, founders of Walker and Associates. We had resources, and for the first time, we were using them as a weapon. The private investigator, a former NYPD detective named Miller, called us 3 days after the party. We met him at a quiet diner in New Haven, far from the prying eyes of our social circle in Greenwich. Abigail, Robert, Miller said, sliding a thick manila folder across the laminated table. What I found is worse than just a debt problem. Christopher has been siphoning funds from the company's escrow accounts for the last 18 months. He's been borrowing to cover his margin calls on those crypto trades. He was about $450,000 in the hole before he started taking from the business. My heart sank. Christopher wasn't just planning a future crime, he was already a thief. And Amber? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Miller leaned in. Amber Wilson, or should I say Amber Thorne, her name from the first marriage in Illinois. I tracked down the brother of her late husband. He's been trying to get someone to listen for years. He's convinced she poisoned his brother, but the local coroner back then was a family friend of hers and signed off on it as a heart attack. She's a pro, Abigail. She finds men with high net worths and weak spots. Christopher was her perfect mark. Entitled, desperate for status, and resentful of his parents' control over the family money. What about the poison? Robert asked, his jaw tight. We found the source, Miller replied. The cousin, Brian, works for a pharmaceutical supply chain in Jersey. He's been under federal investigation for missing inventory before. We have digital footprints of their encrypted chats. They didn't realize that even deleted messages on an iCloud-synced iPad leave ghosts in the system if you know where to look. The plan was chillingly simple. They knew about my mild arrhythmia. They knew my cardiologist, Dr. Eris, had me on a specific regimen. The substance Brian provided would interact with my medication, causing a fatal spike in blood pressure and a subsequent cardiac arrest. It wouldn't show up in a standard toxicology screen, unless the examiner was looking for that specific synthetic compound. So what's the move? Robert asked. We go to the district attorney, Miller said. But we need more than just intent. We need the physical evidence. The vial. Christopher still has it. For the next week, I had to play the role of my life. I had to call Christopher and pretend everything was fine. Hey, honey, I said into the phone, my hand shaking so hard I had to lean against the kitchen counter. I'm so sorry we rushed out of the party. The doctor said it was just a false alarm, a bit of stress. How are you and Amber? Oh, we're fine, Mom. Christopher's voice sounded so normal, so loving. It made my skin crawl. We were just worried about you. Amber even cried a little, thinking something happened to you on your big day. That's so sweet of her, I lied, feeling a bitter taste in my mouth. Listen, I want to make it up to you guys. Why don't you come over for dinner this Friday? Just the 4 of us. I'll make that pot roast you love. We'll be there, Mom. Can't wait. When I hung up, I collapsed into a chair. Robert was right there, catching me. You did great, Abigail. Just a few more days. Friday came. The house was quiet, the air thick with tension. Miller and 2 plainclothes detectives from the Greenwich Police Department were stationed in our home office, watching the feed from the hidden cameras we had installed throughout the kitchen and dining room. Christopher and Amber arrived at 7 p.m. They brought a bottle of expensive Cabernet, a $200 bottle, likely bought with the money Christopher had stolen from our company. To Mom, Christopher said, raising his glass during the appetizers. To many more years of health and happiness. I watched Amber. She was wearing a silk dress, looking every bit the grieving daughter-in-law to be. She kept glancing at my water glass. "Abigail, you look a bit pale," Amber said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Are you feeling okay? Maybe you should take your evening supplements. Do you want me to get them for you?" "That's kind of you, Amber," I said. "They're in the cabinet by the sink." I watched her on the small monitor Robert had hidden under the table. She walked to the kitchen, her back to us. Christopher started talking loudly to Robert about a new development project in Stamford, trying to distract him. On the screen, I saw Amber reach into her small clutch bag. She pulled out a tiny glass dropper. She reached for the glass of water I had set on the counter earlier. Drip, drip, drip. She stirred it with a small spoon, wiped the spoon with a napkin, and tucked everything back into her bag. She walked back into the dining room with a triumphant smile. "Here you go, Abigail. Drink up. It'll make you feel better." She handed me the glass. My handmetash. Her fingers were cold. I looked her straight in the eyes, and for a second, the mask slipped. I saw the predator underneath. "You know, Amber," I said, holding the glass but not drinking. "I was thinking about your first husband. What was his name?" "David?" The color drained from her face. Christopher froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "What? What are you talking about, Mom?" Christopher stammered. "And you, Christopher?" I turned to my son. "I was looking at the escrow accounts for the Stamford project today. There's a nearly $500,000 discrepancy. Care to explain?" "Mom, you're confused. The stress of the party. The party where you tried to kill me?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "The party where you had a vial of synthetic poison ready for my drink?" Christopher stood up, his chair screeching against the hardwood floor. "This is insane. Robert, she's having a breakdown." Robert stood up too, but he didn't look at Christopher. He looked at the door. "Gentlemen, I think we've seen enough." The office door opened, and the detectives stepped out. Amber tried to bolt for the back door, but Miller was already there, blocking her path. "Christopher Walker, Amber Thornwalker, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder," the lead detective announced. The next hour was a blur of flashing lights and handcuffs. I sat at the dining table, watching the police lead my son out of our house in zip ties. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. He looked like a scared, pathetic boy. "Mom. Mom, please." She made me do it. It was her idea. He screamed as they pushed him into the back of the patrol car. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The son I loved had died the moment I read those messages on the iPad. The person being loaded into that car was a stranger. The aftermath was a whirlwind of legal proceedings and emotional exhaustion. Our house, once a sanctuary, felt like a crime scene. Every corner of the living room reminded me of the moment the police led Christopher away. Robert and I spent weeks in meetings with the district attorney's office in Hartford. The evidence was overwhelming. The water Amber had prepared was tested and contained a lethal concentration of a synthetic toxin. Furthermore, forensic accountants discovered that Christopher had been falsifying signatures on corporate documents for months, attempting to bypass the vesting period of his trust fund. The trial was a media circus. The Greenwich grifters, the tabloids called them. I had to testify. Standing in that courtroom, looking at my son in a navy suit, the same one ID bought him for a charity gala a year prior, was the hardest thing I've ever done. He wouldn't look me in the eye. Amber, on the other hand, stared at me with a chilling, vacant coldness. She was sentenced to 25 years for attempted murder and conspiracy, with additional time added once the Illinois authorities reopened the case of her first husband's death. Christopher, due to his cooperation and lack of prior criminal record, received 15 years. After the sentencing, Robert and I decided we couldn't stay in Connecticut. The whispers at the country club and the pitying looks from neighbors were too much. We sold Walker and Associates to a larger firm and moved to a small coastal town in South Carolina. I am 66 now. My life didn't end at 65, though it felt like it might. Robert and I spend our mornings walking on the beach. We've started a small foundation that helps elderly victims of financial abuse. It doesn't take away the pain of losing a son, but it gives us a purpose. Sometimes I receive letters from the correctional facility. I haven't opened them. I'm not sure I ever will. Eve learned that family isn't just about blood, it's about the people who wouldn't put a drop of poison in your glass for all the money in the world. Thank you for listening to my story all the way through. If it resonated with you, give it a like, comment on what touched you the most, and be sure to mention where you're from. Subscribe to the channel. There are plenty more stories to come.